Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey just hit theaters. And if you've seen it, you already know. It's the kind of film that makes you feel like you've been at sea for 10 years yourself. Its opening weekend pulled in more than $264 million globally, which tells you something about how deep this story still runs in people. But here's what the film doesn't tell you. Odysseus's journey home, the monsters, the storms, the decade of wandering, that wasn't just a story someone invented. It was a memory of what it actually felt like to be Greek. And that feeling never went away, because Greek civilization spent 4,000 years living it for real. This video is about all of that, the full arc. From the first palace walls going up in the Bronze Age to the moment the last Greeks were forced off the coast of Anatolia in the 20th century. And then, what happened after that? We're going to follow Greek civilization the way you follow a person, not as a list of dates and battles, but as one continuous story where every chapter grows out of the unresolved problems of the one before it. And I want to flag something now, early, because it's the question that's going to drive everything we cover today. The question isn't just how Greek civilization survived. Lots of things survive. The real question is how a civilization can lose its political home, repeatedly, completely, and still carry enough of itself forward that the people on the other side of that loss still recognize who they are. We're going to get to the answer, but it's not where you'd expect to find it. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning is a palace. Around 1600 BCE, something remarkable was happening on the Greek mainland. A culture we now call Mycenaean was building some of the most sophisticated palace complexes in the ancient world, at Mycenae, at Tiryns, at Pylos. These weren't just royal residences. The Mycenaean palaces relied on redistributive economies, sitting at the center of an interconnected network of trade and diplomacy, with empires exchanging goods like tin, copper, ivory, and luxury items. They had a writing system, Linear B, which scribes used to track grain, livestock, and labor obligations. They had bureaucrats, tax records, standing armies, and trade routes that stretched from Egypt to the British Isles. This was a civilization that had figured out how to run a complex state. And then, around 1200 BCE, it collapsed. The whole thing fell apart in approximately 50 years, between roughly 1200 and 1150 BCE. The key features of the collapse were widespread depopulation, the destruction and desertion of palaces, and the disappearance of Linear B itself, the official writing system of the civilization. The Mycenaean palace complexes at Pylos and Tiryns were burned and abandoned. People fled, trade routes dissolved. The administrative machinery that had held everything together simply stopped functioning. Historians still argue about why. The leading theories point to a convergence of climate change, famine, internal strife, and the collapse of trade networks, which may have forced numerous populations to seek new lands and resources. Some evidence even suggests that many Mycenaean cities were sacked not by foreign invaders, but by their own hungry people. Whatever the precise cause, the result was the same. The knowledge and administrative skills that had supported these civilizations were lost. The collapse of Linear B marked a regression in literacy and bureaucratic administration. The world of vast interconnected states gave way to small, isolated communities struggling to rebuild. This is the first time Greek civilization lost its home. And what happened next is the thing that makes this story so strange and so worth understanding. The major consequence of the fall of Mycenaean Greece was the start of the Greek Dark Ages, lasting roughly 300 years from 1100 BCE to 800 BCE, an era characterized by stagnant population and diminished complexity. The palaces were gone, the writing was gone, the trade networks were gone. By every conventional measure of what makes a civilization, Greece had regressed. But here is what didn't disappear: the language, and the memory of the palaces, of the heroes, of the war at Troy, of the long wandering home afterward. That memory kept moving through the population in the only form it could survive without writing. It became oral poetry. It became Homer. We don't know exactly when Homer lived, or even whether Homer was one person or a tradition of many. What we know is that sometime around the 8th century BCE, two epic poems crystallized out of centuries of oral tradition, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they preserved, in poetic form, the emotional and cultural memory of a world that had been physically destroyed. Close readings of the Odyssey and the Iliad have led scholars to conclude that these poems accurately depict aspects of life in the ancient Bronze Age Mediterranean, even though they are semi-legendary in nature. Homer wasn't writing fantasy, he was writing memory. The Mycenaean world was gone, but its heroes, its gods, its values, its geography, all of it survived inside the poems that every Greek child would grow up hearing. This is the first answer to our central question. When the physical home is destroyed, civilization retreats into language. And language, it turns out, is almost impossible to destroy. Now, the Dark Ages didn't just produce Homer. They also produced the conditions for something completely new. Because when the palace system collapsed, it took centralized authority with it. There was no longer a king at the center redistributing resources, commanding armies, controlling the bureaucracy. And into that vacuum, over the following centuries, grew something that had never existed anywhere in the ancient world before. The polis, the city-state. By around 800 BCE, Greek communities were organizing themselves into hundreds of independent political units: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, and dozens more. Each one self-governing, each one with its own laws, its own calendar, its own identity. This is not an accident. The polis emerged precisely because the palace system had failed. Greeks had watched centralized power collapse so completely that they built their new political world around the opposite principle: distributed, local, participatory governance. The trauma of the Bronze Age collapse was still shaping political philosophy 500 years later. And the polis did something else. They expanded. Because the Greek mainland was mountainous, rocky, and not particularly fertile, and because the city-states kept producing more people than the land could support, Greeks began founding colonies across the Mediterranean, in Sicily, in southern Italy, in what is now southern France, along the coast of the Black Sea, in North Africa. By 500 BCE, there were Greek-speaking communities from Spain to the eastern shores of the Black Sea. The polis model was portable. You could take it with you. You could plant it somewhere new, and it would grow. This is the second piece of the answer. When the land runs out or becomes impossible, Greek civilization moves to the sea. But here's where the story gets complicated in a way that the film doesn't capture. And this is the thing I flagged at the beginning, the open question I want you to keep in mind. Because the polis, for all their brilliance, had a fatal flaw. They couldn't stop fighting each other. Athens and Sparta were the two most powerful city-states, and they were almost perfectly opposed. Athens built its power on trade, on its navy, on democratic institutions and intellectual culture. Sparta built its power on land, on a professional military caste, on a rigidly hierarchical society designed entirely around producing soldiers. They needed each other to defeat the Persian invasions of 490 and 480 BCE, the battles at Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, some of the most consequential military engagements in Western history. But the moment Persia was defeated, the alliance dissolved. And what followed was the Peloponnesian War. Nearly 30 years of Greeks killing Greeks, from 431 to 404 BCE, ending with Sparta's victory and Athens's humiliation. The war didn't just exhaust both sides. It discredited the entire polis model. The city-states had proven that they could produce extraordinary culture, philosophy, drama, architecture, mathematics. But they could not produce lasting political stability. They were too fractious, too proud, too unwilling to subordinate local identity to any larger Greek unity. And that failure created the opening for Macedon. Philip II of Macedon spent the middle of the 4th century BCE doing what no Greek city-state had managed to do. unifying the Greek world by force. His son, Alexander, then took that unified military machine and pointed it east. In 13 years, from 334 to 323 BCE, Alexander conquered Persia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Bactria, and reached the edges of India. It was the fastest and most complete military expansion in ancient history. And when Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, he left behind something that had never existed before. A world where Greek language, Greek culture, Greek institutions, and Greek commercial networks stretched from the Adriatic to the Indus River. This is the Hellenistic period. And it matters enormously for our story because it represents the moment when Greek civilization became genuinely decoupled from Greek territory. You didn't have to be from Greece to be part of Greek civilization anymore. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the greatest centers of Greek learning in the world. Antioch in Syria. Pergamon in Anatolia. Greek culture spread through trade, through administration, through the simple fact that across this vast empire, Greek was the language of commerce, law, and educated life. The home had expanded so far that it was no longer a place. It was a language. It was a set of practices. It was a way of being in the world. But empires don't last. Alexander's generals divided his conquests among themselves, and the Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged spent the next 3 centuries slowly weakening each other through war and succession crises. And into that weakening world came Rome. Rome's absorption of the Greek world was not a sudden conquest. It was a gradual, complicated, and deeply ambivalent process. By 146 BCE, Rome had destroyed Corinth and declared Greece a Roman province. But here is the paradox that every Roman-educated person understood. Greece had conquered Rome culturally, even as Rome conquered Greece militarily. Roman elites learned Greek. Roman poets modeled themselves on Greek poets. Roman philosophers studied in Athens. Roman religion absorbed Greek gods. The Roman Empire, at its height, was in many ways a Greek-speaking empire in its eastern half, administered in Greek, educated in Greek, and saturated with Greek intellectual and artistic tradition. This matters because it means that when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century CE, Greek civilization didn't collapse with it. It had already moved. The eastern half of the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, the city Constantine had founded on the Bosphorus in 330 CE, continued for another 1,000 years. We call it the Byzantine Empire, but the Byzantines called themselves Romans. They spoke Greek. They worshipped in Greek. Their literature, their theology, their legal codes, all of it was written in Greek. Byzantine civilization was, in a very real sense, Greek civilization wearing a Roman name. And Byzantium was not a minor footnote. For 1,000 years, it was one of the most sophisticated and powerful states in the world. It preserved Greek texts, Greek philosophy, Greek mathematics, and Greek theology through the European Dark Ages. When Western Europe was struggling to maintain basic literacy, Constantinople had universities, hospitals, running water, and a legal code, Justinian's Code, that would eventually form the basis of law across most of Europe. But Byzantium also kept losing ground. The Arab conquests of the 7th century took Egypt, Syria, and North Africa. The Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, launched by Western Christians to defend Byzantine territory, ended up weakening Byzantium instead, most catastrophically in 1204, when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople itself, a Christian city attacked by Christian armies. The Byzantine Empire never fully recovered. And on May 29, 1453, Ottoman forces under Sultan Mehmed II breached the walls of Constantinople and ended the Byzantine Empire after 11 centuries. This is the 3rd time Greek civilization lost its political home. And once again, what survived was not a state. What survived was language, memory, religion, and the institutional knowledge carried by the people who fled. Greek scholars fleeing Constantinople brought manuscripts, Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Thucydides, to Italy, where they helped ignite the Renaissance. The Greek Orthodox Church continued to function under Ottoman rule, preserving not just religious practice, but Greek language and Greek identity across 4 centuries of occupation. Greek merchants maintained commercial networks across the Ottoman Empire and beyond, in Venice, in Odessa, in Alexandria, in Marseille. The Greek diaspora, scattered across the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, kept the identity alive through trade, through the church, through language, and through the stubborn insistence that they were still Greek, even without a Greek state. And then, in 1821, they rose up. The Greek War of Independence was one of the most romanticized conflicts in modern history. Lord Byron died for it, European liberals rallied to it. And by 1830, a Greek state existed again for the first time since antiquity. But the new Greece was tiny. It controlled only a fraction of the territory where Greek-speaking people actually lived. Most Greeks were still inside the Ottoman Empire, in Anatolia, in Thrace, in the islands, in the Pontic coast along the Black Sea. The new state immediately began pursuing what Greeks called the megali idea, the great idea, the dream of uniting all Greek-speaking populations into a single modern state. That dream ended in catastrophe. After World War I, Greece attempted to claim the Anatolian coast, where Greeks had lived for 3,000 years, and launched a military campaign deep into Anatolia. By 1922, the campaign had collapsed. Turkish nationalist forces under Mustafa Kemal drove the Greek army into the sea at Smyrna, Izmir, and the city burned. What followed was the largest forced population exchange in modern history up to that point. Approximately 1.2 million Greeks expelled from Anatolia, most of them families who had lived there for generations, many of them in cities, Smyrna, Ephesus, Trebizond, that had been Greek since before Alexander the Great. In exchange, roughly 400,000 Muslims were expelled from Greece. This was the Asia Minor Catastrophe. And it was the moment when the megali idea finally died. The Greeks of Anatolia, the last living connection to the original geography of ancient Greek civilization, were gone, uprooted, sent to a country many of them had never seen, speaking a language that had evolved differently from mainland Greek, carrying with them the memory of cities they would never see again. And here is where the story takes its final and most unexpected turn, because this is the point where I need to tell you what Greek civilization actually became after losing its last territorial anchor. And this is the answer to the question I planted at the beginning. The Greeks became the sea, not metaphorically, literally. The Greek-owned merchant fleet is the undisputed powerhouse of global shipping, controlling nearly 5,800 ocean-going vessels that span the world's oceans. A formidable armada that underscores Greece's centuries-old maritime heritage and its indispensable role in sustaining international trade. Greece remains the world's leading shipping nation, ranking first globally in oil tankers and liquefied natural gas carriers, while holding second place in dry bulk carriers. The value of Greek shipping assets corresponds to 44% of annual GDP, while Greece accounts for only 0.13% of the world's population. Think about that ratio for a moment. A country of 11 million people controls a maritime empire that dwarfs every other nation on Earth. More than 98% of the carrying capacity of the Greek-owned fleet is engaged in transporting goods to and from third countries. Meaning, Greek ships are not moving Greek goods. They are moving the world's goods. Energy from the Middle East to Europe, grain from Ukraine to North Africa, manufactured goods from Asia to America. The Greek fleet is the circulatory system of global trade, and it operates almost invisibly, registered under flags of convenience, managed from offices in Piraeus and London and New York, owned by families whose names you've probably never heard. The dominance of Greek ship owners is no accident. It is the result of strategic foresight, resilience, and a deep-rooted maritime heritage, with Greek shipping dynasties leveraging their expertise, global networks and ability to seize opportunities in volatile markets. This is what the Odyssey has always actually been about. Not a hero trying to get back to an island, a maritime people trying to stay connected to the world after losing their fixed point in it. Odysseus doesn't win by fighting his way home in a straight line. He wins by navigating, by reading the sea, by knowing which currents to follow and which gods to appease and when to hold on and when to let go, and by carrying, through every island and every storm and every delay, the memory of who he was and where he was trying to get back to. Greek civilization has done that for 4,000 years. The palace collapsed, so they carried the memory into poetry. The polis failed, so they carried the culture into an empire. The empire was absorbed, so they carried the language into the Eastern Roman world. Constantinople fell, so they carried the manuscripts and the faith into exile. The Ottoman occupation ended, and the Anatolian Greeks were expelled, so they carried the maritime knowledge and the commercial networks into the global shipping industry. Every time the home was taken away, they put it on a ship. And that brings us back to Nolan's film, which opened just 12 days ago and is already being called one of the defining blockbusters of the decade. Critics have described it as reinvigorating an ancient adventure with majestic sweep, a cinematic epic fit for the biggest screens, proving there's no filmmaker quite like Nolan to steer Odysseus's voyage home. But what the film captures, and what I think is why it resonates so deeply right now, is not just the adventure, it's the longing, the specific aching feeling of being far from home and not knowing if the home you remember still exists when you get there. That feeling is not ancient, it is not historical. It is the feeling of every Greek family that arrived in Athens in 1922, carrying nothing but the clothes on their back and the memory of a city that had just been burned. It is the feeling of every Greek shipowner who built a fleet from the diaspora networks of the 1940s and 1950s because the land hadn't worked out, but the sea always had. It is the feeling of every civilization that has ever had to ask, what do we keep? What do we carry? What are we without the place we came from? The answer Greek civilization found over 4,000 years is this: you are what you remember, and you are what you can do. The language, the faith, the ships, the stories. These are not consolation prizes for losing the homeland. They are the homeland in a form that can survive anything. If this video opened something up for you, if you're now thinking about Homer differently, or about the Byzantine Empire, or about why the Greek shipping fleet exists at all, drop a comment below and tell me which part of this history surprised you most. I read every single one, and the comments on videos like this are genuinely some of the best conversations on this channel. If you want to keep going, the video on the Byzantine Empire goes much deeper into how Constantinople functioned as a civilization in its own right for 1,000 years. That one is linked right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is the kind of channel where that actually matters, because the algorithm buries these longer documentary videos and subscribers are how they find their audience. Odysseus made it home. It just took 10 years, a dozen disasters, and the complete reinvention of who he was along the way. Greek civilization took 4,000 years, and it's still sailing.